Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Journalism Under Fire. We are, of course, in our third week of live streams. This morning, we had a great session with three journalists from across Africa, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Botswana. And we learned all kinds of ways in which African journalism has responded to coronavirus, has been changed by coronavirus, and ultimately has been threatened by coronavirus. And I think that story that's unfolding in Africa today is by far not an uncommon one and not restricted to that continent at all, as we certainly know. If you miss a session, don't worry. It's available on our YouTube channel now, and will be on our website shortly. And it was a really good conversation. We also talked a lot about the International Visitor Leadership Program and the amazing things that program has done for 80 years now. We're taking a break for Thanksgiving after this stream. Let me correct myself. We have one more little stream coming right after this session where we're going to hear from Ambassadors Vicky Huddleston and Marcus Guino on President-elect Biden's selections around national security. We'll be talking about the Secretary of State. We'll be talking about the ambassadors to the United Nations. We'll be talking about the new DNI selection. Lots of things to talk about, lots of reaction to have, and Mark and Vicky have been part of the behind-the-scenes discussions with the Biden team on who will be selected and why. So come and join us. That's at 2 o'clock. I'll put the link right into the chat window. There's no need to register. It's a free event too. And we would love to have all of you, many of you on that call too. So today, of course, we are talking about covering crisis in Indian country. And I want to acknowledge how incredibly difficult this time has been for all of us. And I want to acknowledge in particular, how coronavirus has affected poor and marginalized communities, how it's affected our communities of elders, and particularly how it's affected our tribal communities. This has been an extraordinary challenge for all of us, but for some of us much more than others. So for more on all of this, I'd like to welcome today's moderator and panelists, and I'm going to start by welcoming today's moderator, Conroy Chino. Hi, Conroy.
Hey, Sandy, how are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
So
staying and staying at home.
Good. Stay safe. It's amazing. In that first surge of the virus, I kind of knew people 3 or 4 removed who had it. But now in this surge, I mean, I know at least a dozen people close that have it. So anyway, we all need to stay safe. Anyway, exactly. Conroy, let me just quickly read your bio, and then I have a question for you. So Conroy, of course, is a former television reporter and news anchor, both in Albuquerque and Los Angeles, and over 30 years has produced a number of investigative stories and award-winning documentaries, including Looking Toward Home, a film on urban Indian life in American cities, Surviving Columbus, a historic look at the first contact between Europeans and the Pueblo people of New Mexico, Ancient Pathways, a documentary on Pueblo leadership, and Canes of Power, a historic piece which documents how the Lincoln Canes came to be presented to the 19 New Mexico Pueblo governors. Quite a career, Conroy. But by far, I know the biggest highlight that you've had was coming to Journalism Under Fire in 2018.
That's right.
I joke, but yeah. Tell us what sticks out in your memory from that time. What happened for you there that you think was important or interesting?
Well, first was getting invited to a conference with the title "Journalism Under Fire," and I was very concerned about all the comments and statements that were coming out of the White House, particularly with fake news. Even though I had been out of the news gathering business for a number of years, I continue to have a strong loyalty to the news gathering business. And so I accepted the invitation, and I'm glad I did. I was part of a panel of journalists, actually native journalists at the time, who were asked to talk about covering Indian country. And for the audience, Indian country is still pretty much not a part of everyday news coverage. You don't see many stories on daily newscasts on network, nor many stories on the front pages of major publications. Native people are still in the 21st century in the United States. They're still an invisible group. So I just thought if I could share some of my thoughts and some of my perspective based on my experience as a working journalist in years prior, that will be helpful to the audience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Conroy. Thank you for doing this. I'm going to turn everything over to you right now, and we look forward to a great conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Sandy. And good afternoon and welcome to everyone and to our panel covering the COVID-19 crisis in Indian country here in New Mexico. Again, my name is Conroy Chino and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. And we're glad you could join us, and we're hoping that you plan to stay with us for the entire hour. We welcome all of you that are joining us from across the country and perhaps around the world. We're certainly hoping our panel discussion this afternoon will be informative and intriguing and interesting and worth your time. The primary focus of our panel will be on how Native journalists covered the COVID, or are still covering the COVID-19 outbreak and impact on tribal communities. We'll also explore the major issues and disparities that the virus has uncovered, including those on the sprawling Navajo Nation, as well as in the 19 distinct pueblos here in New Mexico. The journalists will share how tribal leaders responded, especially in some of the most rural areas of our state. We're also going to take a close look at the unfolding educational crisis that many tribal communities are currently experiencing. Facts show that Native children who have already been shortchanged by the state's public educational system, as evidenced by a landmark court case that came down a few years back, are experiencing learning loss in a very serious way during this pandemic. So needless to say, this crisis has touched every New Mexico community, some harder than others. And so this afternoon, we're going to be focusing on the deadly coronavirus and the impact it continues to have on New Mexico tribes. Just a little bit of background. Let me share with you that COVID-19 in the early months infiltrated states and towns and counties, really all across New Mexico at a very rapid rate. And as the virus raged across our state, it hit tribal communities especially hard, driving up the number of positive cases at an alarming rate. And that's important because the data from the New Mexico Health Department showed that Native Americans in the early months of the pandemic made up 37% of all COVID cases. And most of them were clustered in the northwest part of the quadrant, where many tribes have their communities, in particular the Navajo Nation and many of the pueblos. And that number of 37% was alarming because Native Americans only make up 11% of the state's population of 2.3 million. So as this virus was spreading across Indian country, it had tribal leaders in probably every community extremely concerned, especially on the Navajo Nation. COVID-19 was something that tribal leaders and tribal governments had never experienced before coming onto their homelands. Historically, tribes have dealt with many other invasions, but nothing like this one. So this afternoon, I want to begin by calling on two of our panelists who are members of the Navajo Nation and covered the COVID-19 crisis on tribal lands. And first we have Arlyssa Becenti, who is a reporter with the Navajo Times. And also joining us is Sharon Chischilly, who is an independent photojournalist who worked with some reporters with national publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post, who came to New Mexico to cover the crisis. I want to begin with Arlyssa and begin by sharing some of her information, her bio. She is, as I mentioned, from the Navajo Nation, a Diné journalist from Fort Defiance in Arizona, is a graduate of Arizona State University, and began work over at the Gallup Independent. Gallup is a town west of here, about west of Albuquerque, towards the western boundary of New Mexico. And she went to work for the Navajo Times, which is a small publication out of Window Rock, Arizona. well, since 2016. Uh, and in the course of her years of reporting, she's been the recipient of some awards, including the Arizona Newspaper Association, the New Mexico Press Association, the Native American Journalists Association, and the Arizona Press Club. So welcome, Arlyssa. We're glad you could join us. I will leave it up to you to introduce yourself by your clanship ties. So, and then I want to get into some questions about your coverage of the COVID-19 crisis. So, Arlyssa?
Yate, Shay, Arlyssa Becenti, Inishia, not o Diné touching initially, but Annie Bashichin, Kilichin, Dashiche, Adoki Ani Dashinella. I'm Arlyssa Becenti. I am the Navajo government reporter for the Navajo Times, and this is probably my 5th year with the Navajo Times. So I've been a reporter for almost 10 years now.
Covering mainly tribal government, correct?
For the whole duration.
Okay. Arlyssa, if you could give us give the audience some sense about the Navajo Nation, the geography. It cuts across a number of states, and it's one of the largest tribe in the country, correct?
I think it's behind the Cherokee.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think we're number 2 in the largest tribe, but we have the largest land base, I believe. That's what I believe right now. It's as they like to compare it to West Virginia, the state. So that's pretty large and massive. It goes from Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And so that's what we cover. Northern Arizona is where I'm from, and that's basically the area that I cover mostly. And New Mexico a little here and there. In Utah, we have our own reporter who also covers that area as well.
Right, but pretty rural.
Yeah.
Right. Rural. And so, can you give us some idea of what that means?
Well, there's 11 grocery stores, and like I said, we are comparable to West Virginia. So 11 grocery stores in that big, massive space that's insane. So that
pretty far apart, not clustered in one area. I mean, it takes a while to drive to a local grocery store to get food and other supplies, and then also to get gas. I would imagine gas stations aren't just down the road, right? Mm-hmm. Dirt roads.
Yeah, gas stations. If with our supermarkets being only 11 on the Navajo Nation, gas stations have become the source of food, and which is a contributing factor to our diabetes epidemic, and as well as we're also considered a food desert. So yeah.
And that became an issue, as I think we all found out, in terms of underlying health conditions. But let me ask you this: when did you and the Navajo Times realize that this was a major issue, and that COVID-19, as it was spreading across tribal lands, would have serious consequences?
Well, we really didn't know what was to expect. I know the Navajo government was getting ready. Weeks before we got our first COVID cases on March 17th, the tribe was having their own meetings to get ready and to get prepared for what was to come. And they had their health facilities and care providers come, and they would meet. And that was the last meeting I ever remember covering, where there's people all in one room. And after March 13th, the school closures had happened, and government offices were being closed. And then a few days later, we got our first 2 coronavirus reports. And from then on, after we received the first 2 confirmation of COVID cases, every day from then on, I was on Navajo Times Twitter page and my Twitter page, and I was recording the numbers that were coming in day after day. And first it would start off with single digits, and then all of a sudden it would go to double, and then finally in May we hit our peak at over 200 cases
per day.
Yeah, in 24 hours. Yeah.
Wow. So describe for me the tribal government's response to the COVID-19 crisis as it was unfolding, being a government reporter?
Like I said, they were trying to get as prepared as possible, especially with the health facilities. We have, I believe, 12 healthcare facilities, either IHS or 638. And I guess that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to get prepared as much as they possible. But when finally it increased and it became more of the numbers started to rise and become even more of a scary sight to see. That's when in April, when our Navajo Nation government put these health mandates on all of Navajo Nation. So they closed parks and recreation centers. Our parks are very famous, from Monument Valley to Antelope Canyon. And then those are still closed. They closed down the schools, the government, as well as, making sure that we have mask mandates. We've had mask mandates since April. And then we had lockdowns, weekend lockdowns, and that was in April. And then curfews that's when we just stop at 8 p.m. and everyone has to go home. The gas stations for a while were closed, like the gas pumps. And so you couldn't, I guess the whole thing was, if you don't have anywhere to go, then you'll stay home. And that's what they were trying to do.
Well, I watched, obviously daily newscasts as the crisis was raging across New Mexico, and there was daily reporting on the number of cases coming out of the Navajo Nation, and it became very concerning as the numbers began to rise. But what was contributing, based on your reporting, to the spread?
I believe it was lack of infrastructure, water infrastructure, multi-generational homes, all of this that was being reported, not just by community journalists or papers, but also mainstream media. And that's when we received our CARES funding from the government. It was a battle. We had to sue along with other tribes to get this CARES funding, and we received, I don't know, 714 million in all. And throughout the whole summer, it was the council delegates, our lawmakers, and our president trying to find a common ground on how to spend these CARES funding to build these infrastructures that we needed, as well as broadband and bringing internet and Wi-Fi and water. And so those were contributing factors.
Can you speak to the situation out there on the Navajo Nation? You described it as being very wide and expansive and very rural. What were some of the challenges that families were facing during this pandemic, particularly in rural areas and low-income families? You also mentioned intergenerational groups living under one roof in one household, but were there other challenges that the families were facing?
I think it was just, our multi-generational homes. I grew up in it, so we've had many family members under one roof, and so of course.
How about running water? Because one of the things that we were always told was to wash your hands constantly and consistently in order to prevent the spread.
Yeah, Sharon even mentioned it, that she grew up without water, and that is common among people who live out in the rural areas of the Navajo Nation. And being able to get water, you have to either go to the wells, or you have to pay for it at different sites where our Navajo Tribal Utility Authority has these points where you can get water, and you buy it from there. And so it would take, I don't know, especially with the roads, the horrible roads. We have really bad roads, as well as not having, the time or the resources to go out there and drive 20, 30 miles to get water, not just for you, but for your animals as well. And, it was just, that in itself is really problematic, and it created a whole issue. And so when you're telling people to wash your hands for 20 seconds, that's wasting a lot of water. And that water is not easy, it's not easy to get. You have to go out
Right.
and get it.
Right. So let me ask you this just before I turn to Sharon. Arlyssa, how difficult was it for you personally as a member of the Navajo Nation to cover this story?
Oh my goodness. I think the frustration that came from reporting on coronavirus, especially right now, is the way the government, our Navajo Nation government, had responded. And there's a lot of politics being played over the summer on how to spend this money. And I remember being so frustrated because as a member, and these are my lawmakers, these are my leaders, I'm thinking, why can't you just settle this? And I know it's a lot of hard work and it's a lot of negotiations, but sometimes I would see points where I'd be like, you're all just not taking this serious enough to understand that time is of the essence. We need to spend this money by December 30th, and it's already July, August, um, so on and on. So that to me was the most frustrating part because I see people that I hear of people and I see people who need this money, and to help them get through a second wave, which is what we're in right now.
All right. Thank you, Arlyssa. I want to ask Sharon, who's also with us at today's panel. As I mentioned earlier, she's a photojournalist who spent some time working with reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post. And her photos, which we'll share with you, have appeared not only in these publications, but also the Wall Street Journal, if I recall, Sharon. But Sharon is a junior over at the University of New Mexico, and she tells us that her first experience with a camera was when she purchased a film camera, if you can believe that, just a few years back before she started college. She spent some time working for the student newspaper, the student publication called, excuse me, the Daily Lobo, back in August of 2019. And as I mentioned, her work has been featured in some major national newspapers. And I want to welcome her. So welcome, Sharon.
Hello. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So what was your experience like as a photojournalist working with reporters from these national publications and as they were covering the COVID crisis?
Well, as a member of the Navajo Nation, my friends and family have been directly impacted by the virus. So, in the beginning, it was really hard just because it was pretty scary. I didn't want to go out into the assignment and then bring back the virus to my family. So I had to be really careful whenever covering in the Navajo Nation.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of stories were these reporters focusing on?
Just mostly members who had the virus, and how it impacted them and their family.
Did they do this remotely or did they actually show up on the Navajo reservation?
They showed up to the Navajo Nation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I would just meet the reporters and we would go to their house or meet them somewhere, and then that's where they would do the interview and I would take
How do they find you? How do they know to call on you to work with them?
Well, it really all started from the Washington Post. The reporter happened to be at one of the food distribution that happened in the beginning of the pandemic. And I wasn't on an assignment. I wasn't working for the Navajo Times at the time. So I was just kind of working for myself. And a Washington reporter came up to me and asked me if they could use my photographs. And from there, my career has skyrocketed. I mean, I've been getting a lot of assignments for the New York Times, which is really cool.
Very good. Very good. So tell us, if you would, some of the challenges in working with, for lack of a better term, a non-Indian reporter, especially someone coming to the Navajo Nation from out of state. I don't know where the reporters were coming in or flying in from. But what was that like? And what did you have to do to prep them, to get them ready, or to share with them, how to go about perhaps getting the best and most compelling story?
Yeah. Well, so we had I had a reporter that I worked with, and he was working for a national outlet. He interviewed multiple people who didn't know how to speak Navajo. So s- so he would send me the audio for the interview, and I would ask my boyfriend's mom to translate it for me and for him for him to write
Oh,
about it.
interviewing somebody who spoke no English, but only Navajo
Yeah,
to get the questions to them. Okay.
yeah. So
Okay.
and yeah.
So you were kind of the intermediary between the reporter and a family, or whoever was the subject of the interview.
um I'm not, I mean, I know he was interviewing just someone who was waiting in line for the food distribution, and yeah, they didn't know really much English. They mostly spoke in Navajo, so um that's where I kind of came in. I mean, I don't talk Navajo fluently, but
Hmm.
I do know people who do.
Okay. Okay. I know that we have some of your photos, and if I could ask Sandy to bring them up, perhaps you can, go through them and talk a little bit about the content.
Yeah, so this one
Yeah.
so this photograph I photographed for the New York Times, and Um, they didn't really send me to this location. I kind of just stumbled across this worker who was cleaning the carts, and this is one of the photos I submitted.
And this is at a grocery store on the reservation, correct?
Yes, this is taken in Winter Rock at Bashes.
Okay. Bashers is like a Safeway or Piggly Wiggly or Albertsons, correct?
Yes.
How about this photo?
So this photograph was also taken for the New York Times. So this is actually a an elder that was diagnosed with COVID-19. And so the nurses from Kianto would deliver food and supplies to to families who are diagnosed with COVID. And so I really like this photograph a lot, actually, because you can't really see it, but she's laughing behind her mask at her grandson just because of the way he was holding the cat. Um, and I don't know, I think this is a really nice moment. I was really happy to capture it just because there was a little bit of hope, even though there's a whole pandemic happening.
Correct. You have more photos? Okay. Here's another one.
Yeah, this is Betty Bennett. She was also diagnosed with COVID-19, and this was taken inside her hogan in Kienta. Um, and so before this, the nurse put down supplies and food for her. And so for this moment, she was just looking at the stuff she received.
And this photo?
This one is going to be located near Ganado. Um, this is Nathaniel Garcia. I This was taken for the New York Times as well. They didn't send me to this location. I happened to just to drive by, and what really caught me was his sign. And so I decided to pull over and talk to him because he was working outside in front of his around his home. And so I pulled over and I spoke to him, and I asked him if I could take a portrait of him with his sign that he made. And yeah.
Good enough. Well, you've taken some amazing photos. How about just one more? And then I'm going to go to Shaun next. Right,
Yeah.
Sharon?
So the Navajo, I mean, sorry, the New York Times asked me if I wanted to join their election coverage. I believe they had 100 photographers to document. So they asked me, and I agreed to it. And so this one is a Trump supporter in Shiprock, and he invited me into his home to take photographs of him watching the elections. And so this is actually his response when Trump took Florida.
Okay, I'm not sure if you want to go back and ask him for his reaction today. Well, thanks a lot, Sharon. Thank you for sharing your photos and your work with us. I next want to turn to Shaun Griswold with the publication called New Mexico in Depth. Shaun is Pueblo, and he's from the Pueblos of Laguna, Jemez, and Zuni, and grew up in Albuquerque and in Gallup. He brings a decade of print and broadcast experience covering forest fires and issues regarding police reform, um, as well as covering tribal communities in urban areas, covering issues like education and child welfare. He's also, I understand, an avid Broncos fan and a fan of Lamar or Kendrick Lamar. Is that correct, Shaun?
I gotta first say that I'm not a Broncos fan, but
Oh,
cover
you're not? Okay.
Pittsburgh Steelers. I do love Kendrick Lamar, and also I could probably spend the rest of the session looking at Sharon's photos and her stuff.
Okay, absolutely, absolutely, some great work. But let me start out by asking you a similar question that I asked Arlyssa, and that is to describe the Pueblos. I mentioned earlier there are 19 of them here in New Mexico, but what is distinct about the Pueblos?
The
Share that with
significant
the audience.
Pueblos, New Mexico's Pueblos run along basically from the northern part of the state to the southern part of the state, and then Zuni is a little bit towards the western part of the state. They're all distinct tribal governments. You know, you're talking, New Mexico has 23 tribes, including the Navajo Nation, the 19 Pueblos, and there's also 3 bands of Apache. So you're dealing with 23 different governments, each with its own ideas, each with its own perspective, its own leadership. And so what happened immediately to talk with March was Pueblo government started to institute lockdowns, closures. Some of these communities are small in a lot of ways. I think if you were to combine all of the Pueblos in terms of population size, you would probably need to multiply it by 5 to even match what the Navajo Nation size is. So they're smaller governments, but they're also governments that are quite effective, and they're doing a lot to enhance their people. One quote that really stuck out to me very early on was from a governor from the Picaris Pueblo, who was discussing shutting down, and he mentioned that if COVID were to come to our community, it would wipe out the Picaris people. And so just hearing that early on, it really had to. I mean, you see some of the intersection when it comes to multi-generational homes. That was kind of a big thing that led to spread of some of these pueblos early on. But at the same time, there was also like a very sovereign direct action for communities and governments to shut down entire communities, to impose lockdowns. And they were able to do that without any pushback.
Besides the lockdowns, what else were tribes and tribal governments, and maybe even including the state, doing to minimize the threat and to protect families, especially like you said, Picaris Pueblo in the northern part of the state is a very small Pueblo, and I'm guessing they only probably have a couple of hundred tribal members. So what was being done to protect them?
I mean, a complete shutdown and lockdowns are one of the significant areas to that. What was interesting to watch here in New Mexico, as opposed to other states, is that there was a really strong relationship between state government and tribal governments. And so even just constant updates as to what's happening, or testing sites that were specific to Pueblo people. There's a lot of these, some of the most tested, COVID tested people in New Mexico live within a tribal community. And so it's not unfamiliar for us to understand how to go to the store, if we have to get them, like, you know, if we're wearing masks or washing our hands or even getting tested. Like, this has been our reality since March. And this was really significant with the decline of some of these cases that impacted us immediately. And that's where the state of New Mexico did play a role, because it understood the significance of how this virus was going to affect these communities, and work with them to ensure that they could do to keep their people safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, I mentioned earlier, Shaun, as part of your reporting, you've covered education as an issue, and I know that we're both aware of the data when it comes to Native students, in particular the math and reading test scores, the low graduation rates, and the high dropout rate for Native students. And there was this landmark lawsuit that I mentioned called Yazi Martinez, where a number of tribal families and Hispanic families sued the state of New Mexico. And the outcome was of the lawsuit was that it confirmed what many of us already knew to be true. And you had a judge then who ruled that the state of New Mexico had failed to provide a sufficient education for children of color. But in your reporting, could you tell us what the COVID-19 crisis exposed when it came to education? I know that when we were talking, you spoke about the disparities, particularly now when children across the country, but particularly in tribal communities, are being forced to attend class online.
Yeah, that you know, I still think that we're not going to exactly know what the disparities are, like some of the immediate like education disparities. I'm talking like grades, I'm talking education gap for these communities, until I think we get through this first full year of what's really going on. But what was immediate was lack of broadband internet access. I think that we immediately came to the understanding, and leadership finally understood in New Mexico, that internet is it's a right. It should be treated as a public utility. It's not a privilege, because you know, when you're dealing with right now 2 semesters with school. So I'm talking spring of last year. The first thing that was noticed was school districts who did not have the ability to be able to do social distance learning online had to pivot in a way that was going to provide their students some sort of education just to end the school year. So for districts, like I covered a school district, it's called Cuba Independent School District. And in terms of landmass, you know, it's the size of Rhode Island. And it's also home to 80% of Native American students who are Navajo, as well as some Pueblo. They don't have internet access for their students. There's some students there who still don't have electricity. So the school district had to devise this take-home packet plan where where bus drivers and school officials would drop off education materials to students. Now, when you mentioned Yazi Martinez, part of that is an education model that's focused on culturally relevant curriculum. Now, this is sort of at the heart of a lot of the Yazi Martinez lawsuit and the settlement. So it basically, you know, in short, it says that you're not creating curriculum that fits the needs and the needs of the communities that these students are from. So when you're talking about culturally relevant curriculum, one of the programs that Cuba had designed was a program where they were doing Navajo weaving coursework that taught students math, taught students history, taught students social studies. It sort of hits all the core elements of what students are supposed to learn. There was a Three Sisters garden where students were growing you know, vegetables in their home. And then they also have to write about like how this is related to their culture. And students are succeeding at these type of education models. So it was a little unfortunate that COVID hit, because, you know, the Yazi Martinez settlement is, you know, very, very new. It's 2 years old. So we're at the very beginning of developing these education models that are gonna make New Mexico, you know, leave that position of like being 50th or 49th when it comes to education goals.
Let me ask you this, Shaun. I saw a report recently that showed that children, excuse me, left to learn online the report was basically on children in urban areas urban communities who were literally being lost. They were no longer engaging, and they were no longer showing up for class virtually. And I was wondering, given your coverage of this issue in or on tribal lands, has your reporting uncovered any of this?
Yeah, so the very initial study so the state of New Mexico has a tracking system that's looking at students who aren't showing up. Now, this is in design and coordination with the public education department, as well as the child welfare department. So they're checking in on students who aren't showing up to classes. The first report that came down a few months back is that 1 in 5 students were not only failing a class, but that 25% of students were also showing up for school. And so the disparities there could be, especially, so now we're talking urban setting here. I think that there's a difference between what is creating inequality with the rural setting, which I think is like primarily directed with the digital divide issue of just not having internet. Within the urban setting, you live in a city that has the internet, but your house may not have broadband that can accommodate your parents, maybe your other siblings. So like I lost count at the number of students that I've talked with who, and this is like people who are in elementary school all the way up into college, who end up at a McDonald's parking lot to use Wi-Fi to finish an assignment, to upload assignments that they can then go do offline. So the barriers that COVID created within the digital divide has just been enormous. And I think it goes back to the structural inequalities of nobody cared for these rural communities to have internet before until right now. And in fact, we're dealing with that like New Mexico legislators are currently debating how to spend $50 million in CARES Act money that would go direct to supporting social distance learning as well as telehealth. But we're finally seeing that investment here because we realize the reality that if you don't have the internet, you're going to fall behind.
Right, right. Let me ask this last question, Shaun, before we go to the audience for some questions and answer Q&A. We were talking earlier about the general election and the native vote. Well, 2 things. One, I was wondering if you could share with the audience the significance of the turnout in tribal communities for the general election, as well as the impact that COVID-19 had on the ability for folks living on tribal lands to vote.
Yeah, that's a very significant thing. And I can only speak to New Mexico tribes on this one. And, we had 2 elections this year. We had a primary and a general. Our primary elections had a record number turnout for New Mexico party-based primaries. So Democratic turnout, which is the significant number of registered Native American voters, are Democrats. Well, the state had a primary election that had record turnout. Native American precincts saw a decrease. And that happened to do with like a significant number of access to polling sites and locations. There's also a history here of Native Americans who just only vote in person. Absentee ballots are still something that people are trying to understand. And so in my coverage and talking with people who are election advocates, after the primary, they saw that issue and then diverted their focus to remind tribal communities that you should participate, and you should participate by voting by mail. That was the entire, for months from the primary into the general, that was the effort from election advocates. Now, unfortunately, there wasn't not a significant number of absentee ballots that were requested within Native American voting centers. I'm actually trying to work through this at the moment where we're trying to determine what some of the actual issues were that led to access voting. Now, New Mexico opened up a lot of access. That I won't default New Mexico for not having for making elections hard. It was really easy to vote in New Mexico. But when you're from a community that got locked down a week before the election, you're not able to go vote in person. You
Right.
then have to now file an emergency COVID provisional ballot that is just now getting counted. And at the same time, you're dealing with a state that's going to be blue regardless. I mean, New Mexico was definitely going to be a Democratic state. That was well known. But you're dealing with a population that might have just been taken for granted that, hey, we don't, if these votes aren't going to be here, we're still going to be blue regardless. And that has to do with leadership from top down, because while most, within the 19 pueblos, they do have voting sites. I will say that within all 19 pueblos, and then within many within the Apache as well as Navajo districts, there are voting sites that are available. But there were also several pueblos that went on lockdown because of COVID spikes a week ahead of the election.
Good enough. Shaun, thank you very much for your answers and comments, as well as Arlyssa and Sharon. I'll turn it back over to Sandy for help us get through the Q&A. Sandy?
For sure. So folks, time to type your questions into the Q&A box. The one that jumped out to me touches on the point that you just were talking about, Conroy and Shaun, which is from Michaela. And she says, with more Native representation in our US Congress, do you believe more funding and attention is coming to Native communities? Will this help with the COVID-19 pandemic as well? Arlyssa, why don't I throw that one to you?
I think when it comes to representation in Congress or anyone, in the federal capacity, you have to know exactly what they're wanting to do and what their whole message is. They could be Republican and they could be Democrat. It really doesn't matter. It just depends on whether they themselves want to concentrate on their native tribes or tribes all over and help them. That's what I personally believe. Because I think it was six new representatives in Congress. It cuts it in half, Republican and Democrat. So I think it just depends on the person and what they're wanting to do.
You want to comment on that, Shaun?
Yeah, I mean, in New Mexico, we have, Representative Deb Haaland, and then we also have Yvette Harrell, and Deb is a Democrat and Yvette is a Republican. Both are Native American congressional members. And so for our 3 congressional seats in New Mexico, they're filled right now by 2 Native Americans who are on the complete opposite of the political spectrum right now. And so representation is great, and I think we need to continue pushing forward with it. But I feel like we're getting to the point now, a tipping point, where representation can now lead to accountability. And that's going to be on us to really kind of fix that and get that going.
Yep. Sharon, I want to show one of the photos of yours we didn't get to, which I thought was my favorite one. So I'm just going to do this. Can you tell us about this photo?
Yeah, so the person in the image is going to be Betty Bennett, sorry. And she is diagnosed with the COVID-19. She lives in Kayenta, and this was after the nurses at the Kayenta hospital delivered food and supplies to her. Yeah.
And Sharon, do you have any issues from folks not wanting you to take their picture, or do they embrace, please take my picture or help document our story? Or how do you navigate some of those dynamics of, taking a very real piece of technology to capture their realities?
Well, I haven't really ran into any issues, but usually when I do go out and photograph, I do introduce myself and I kind of start up a conversation just for them to get more familiar with me and comfortable with me. So in this case, I asked her if I could take a portrait of her, and she was okay with it.
That's beautiful. And I know there's one more, let's just do it. Here it is. Tell us about this one, Sharon.
So this one was taken in Winslow at the hospital, and the room that they are passing is usually where a COVID-19 patient or someone who was diagnosed with COVID-19 would stay in the room number 7. And so when I was there wasn't any COVID-19 patients at the time.
Great shot too. You have an eye, as they say. Let me ask Arlyssa a question that comes from Laura Pascas, who presented for us last night, again on our YouTube channel. If you missed it, it was fantastic on the environmental crisis. And she says, what are some of the other issues that you wish you had more time to dig into in your beats? Obviously, we're all covering crisis and covering coronavirus in particular, but are there other stories that you're missing out on or that you wish you had time to cover?
I think education listening to Shaun, I'm learning things from what he's covering in New Mexico. And, you know, we have such a small, I say our team is tiny but mighty, because we have such a small editorial group. And, you know, it's up to us. Our editor gives us free range to cover what we want. But with me, it's with government. And I think education is just something that we're kind of lacking in our coverage in the newspaper. And that is something I would definitely I would want to delve into. I would like to.
And are there specific education stories that you're kind of following or that you feel need more investigation?
I think more is how learning, virtual learning is going for the students. I know from council, they don't want in-person learning. They even voted on it, the Navajo Nation Council, and the president agreed to that. And just recently, Gallup McKinley went back to virtual learning, and they applauded that, our tribe. And so that's one thing I would want to find out and talk to students. You know, how are you able to keep up with your school's curriculum? And I know broadband, just like Shaun, just everything Shaun was saying, it's something that is, I think we're lacking in our own coverage too for the Navajo Nation. Yeah. And broadband is one of them as well.
Let me throw this one over to Shaun. This is from Bodie Russell. And the question is the New Mexico Health Department keeping track of specific COVID numbers across pueblos? Or is this your job as journalists to keep track of numbers?
Yeah, that's been something we've been working to figure out. There is a question of data sovereignty where tribes can control what numbers they want to release. And that's been done honestly, like some of them say it's for a level of protection. Some tribes that are in or near cities or near Albuquerque in particular are afraid of any retaliation of this idea that like they're the ones who are spreading the virus more often. We've gotten to a point now where we can identify zip codes and census tracts that allow us to be able to identify the areas and the regions where tribes are. But tribes are also releasing some of their own data as well. Again, it just depends on which tribe is out there. So yes, to kind of both questions, you know, the state has gone to the point where it is releasing numbers that takes the reporter's job to figure out which communities these represent.
Yeah. Here's a question that I'll ask each of you to reflect on, and maybe Arlyssa, I'll start with you. It's from Billy Blair. Hi, Billy. She says, what obstacles did any of you encounter while trying to cover COVID-19? And what do you think has made it more challenging to cover COVID-19 in Indian country?
I really haven't gotten any challenges. I think more than anything, it's really out there to the community to do community reporting, because I'm too busy thinking about covering the Navajo Nation government and how to be held accountable from our readers and our own people. And I think that's most important, because we have wonderful reporters within the Navajo Times who are doing fantastic community reporting, like Cindy Earth and Krista Allen. And so those are the obstacles I put in myself by not going out there and reporting on the communities at hand. And I forgot the other question.
It was, has any of this made it more challenging to cover issues in your beat?
No, because right now our whole Navajo Nation government is it's nothing. It's all they're talking about right now is the coronavirus and the CARES Act and everything, and how they can help their people and how to spend this money and expend this money. The thing that I did cover over the summer, which wasn't really coronavirus related, was the Shiprock hemp issue that was happening in Shiprock, New Mexico. And I think I kind of put the COVID reporting to the wayside so I could tackle that instead. And that was throughout the whole summer, and you know, it still continues, and I'm just waiting for the conclusion of it.
And is it hard? I'll just stay with you, Arlyssa, for a second. Is it hard to balance those competing priorities? There's so much happening. Is it particularly challenging?
It is, because, you know, like I said, we're very tiny and we have a huge reservation to cover, and there's so much more that is in need of attention, and you just can't get to it all.
Yeah. Shaun, question for you around that same issue of obstacles. You know, have you experienced significant obstacles in your reporting, especially on coronavirus?
The one that always comes to mind is just access. I mean, if I'm trying to cover 23 different tribes, each tribe has different restrictions on how to access. And in terms of reporting, it's so essential to be able to work with these communities with a face-to-face introduction. You have to be in the communities to get to know them. But when they're closed and shut down, it's almost impossible to make a proper introduction. And so that's been my hardest goal or my hardest issue in terms of breaking through the access problem. If I can't be there in person, I have to figure out ways to like make a consistent presence digitally.
Right. Sharon, let me ask you one more question, which is, you are very much at the beginning of your career, but also skyrocketing upwards and onwards. How does it feel to see your photos printed in national and global publications? And what's next for you? Are you going to keep shooting away, or do you have a specific project on the go, or what? Tell us a little bit about what's coming next for you.
Well, I think it's really cool to see my name, especially in the New York Times. So funny because before the pandemic, I would go to a restaurant. My teacher gave me a New York Times paper, and I remember like eating pancakes and like looking at it and just thinking like, oh wow, like I wonder when I'll see my name in this paper. And like a couple months later, my name was on the paper of the New York Times. I think my next goal right now is just to focus on photographing. I did start a full-time position at the Navajo Times yesterday, so mostly focus on that, and hopefully down the road I'll be able to take photographs of like animals or something for National Geographic. Yeah.
Well, that sounds fantastic, and best of luck to you. Thank you so much for all of you for joining. Conroy, you are a master moderator. Thank you so much for all your questions and attention to detail. Shaun Griswold, thank you. Arlyssa Becenti, thank you. Sharon Chischilly, thank you, and best of luck to you all. And let's hope that this period can come to a close. And next year, when we have you come back in person to Santa Fe for the conference, we can talk about all the other things that are going on. So once again, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Have a great day, one and all. Bye-bye.